All right, welcome back. So, 1915 in the arc of World War One was a complex and a difficult year. And I'm going to highlight just a couple of events for this mini lecture that it's important to understand that these, of course, had a real effect not only within the arc of that year, but within the overall process of the war itself. So, again, there's a lot more than what we're going to mention here that goes on in 1915, but just trying to highlight this as folks sort of grapple with the complex realities of that year and of the war itself. All right, so let's get into it. So remember, fall of 1914, war begins, armies mobilize. Particularly, you have this attempt to defeat France within mobilization plus 39 days. You have the failure of that on the part of the Germans to be able to do so. And then you have this front stabilization in the West that will exist for hundreds of miles and will last through much of until 1918. So part of the story of the arc of 1915 then is that front stabilization in the West is the story of that front stabilization. It is the story of the sort of structured trench warfare that when we tend to think of World War One is a fairly common reality and experience for many, particularly on the Western Front. But it is also a time of, so you would have bombardments, you would have mass mobilization, and armies, attacking certain, sort of areas and then retreating, right? And very little ground being taken, the existence of no man's lands right here as well. Um, Probably one of the bigger campaigns or events that occurs in the arc of 1915 is going to be the campaign for Gallipoli. So the Ottoman Empire in 1915 had thrown its support behind Germany. And so what you had on the part of the British Empire, led by Winston Churchill in this effort, was a view that if you were to attack into Turkey and attack into the Ottoman world, that by doing that, you would be able to kind of upset the balance of that front stabilization, that you might cause kind of a reallocation of the process there. And so the British in early to mid 1915 will deploy hundreds of thousands of troops with the goal being to be able to do that. Now, a lot of these troops are going to be Australian and New Zealand Army Corps troops, and they're going to fight incredibly hard for a long period of time. But Turkish forces are going to ultimately defeat them. And so that by the time British forces will leave this campaign, will cut off this campaign, you've got something like 500,000 casualties, right? It's a really, really, really terrible thing. I mean, Churchill's gonna lose his position of power, and Gallipoli ends up being seen as this just terrible failure on the part of the Allies because it achieves very little in terms of its overall objectives. So it's pretty bad. In terms of other really big things to be thinking about with 1915, is going to be the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania is a ship that had Americans on board, and they're going to lose their lives in this U-boat sinking. So, remember, beginning of World War One, you had a greater use, a more common use of submarines in the conflict. We of course see submarines as a normalized part and process of maritime war now, but of course in 1914, 1915, still seen as relatively new. The sinking of the Lusitania will have some immediate effects, and it's going to have a much sort of longer term effect. Now, I recognize that for many, there is a view that the Lusitania is kind of the direct link between, sort of German violence and an American entry into the conflict. That there's a view that sort of once Lusitania happens, it's pretty clear that we're going to get involved in the war. And the thing to think about is that's not the case, right? So the Lusitania is sunk in early 1915. The United States doesn't enter the war until nearly 2 years later. But the sinking of the Lusitania does have a real effect in transforming American public opinions about the war versus what those opinions had been prior to the Lusitania being sunk. Because you had some communities that were supportive of either the German side, you had some who were supportive of the British side, but the U.S. had this relatively neutralish stance during the war at that point. But this idea of German attacks, particularly ones that are killing Americans, is going to start to have an effect. All right. Thank you very much.